Right then, welcome to what is not necessarily a video tutorial or a guide, but just a description really and a breakdown of my process when acting as a colorist on a film. I've been given kind permission from both Philip Stevens, the director, and from Stuart McGregor, the DOP of the film The Last Viking, just to talk through some of my process and share how I approached it, both in terms of the colour work, but also how I approached it in terms of the best workflow when working with a client. Also, as part of this, I'm going to be talking a little bit about how I worked in particular with the red footage coming through, the raw red footage, 5K, coming off the red camera, and specifically how to treat that. Or one possible way of treating that and working with that inside DaVinci Resolve. So what I've got here is the actual DaVinci Resolve project for The Last Viking, and you can see I've currently got the first shot of the film selected, which is a long handheld shot of our protagonist bursting into a hut during a battle, desperately seeking for water, and then collapsing on a bed. And what you can see here is we've got the viewer of what the viewer would see here. I've got my stills gallery where I've saved my grades and stills of key shots throughout the film. As a first tip for my workflow, I tend to, once I've got a completed workflow, a completed grade of each shot, I capture a still of each and every single shot. So then I've got those back to re-add if for any reason my nodes get deleted. But also I can export by right-clicking and export a still, which exported correctly, I can export all the grading information and import that into another project, but also I can export it as a still to send to the client or use for publicity. So I'm just going to close down my stills gallery because I'd normally use two monitors, but because I'm doing this tutorial I can only use one. And that's just to tidy up my interface a little bit. So here we go. I'm just going to show you my node tree here. I'm not going to use any keyboard shortcuts just to keep things clear. And you can see the breakdown of my nodes as they come through. So we've got the final output here, and we've also got the input coming from the raw footage here. Now if I was to toggle it off at the top here, this will toggle all these nodes off. So that's as it looked coming off the chip of the camera, and this is what it looks like when the grade is finished. So let's just toggle this off and look at the scopes. So you can see with the footage coming in at this point, the exposure is fairly low because of just the shooting conditions, but also the DOP, Stuart, is something I admire greatly, really likes to get the look of the film as close as he can in camera. So then, and we'll look at that a little bit more later, just to kind of nail the look as much as possible in camera. So then when you get to the grading stage, it's more a creative process rather than a kind of a scientific one. And so if we look at our waveform, yes, most of our trace is sitting below the middle, but it is a dark scene. You know, it's a very shadowy, dark, underlit scene. So in essence, the realism of this scene in particular calls for that kind of naturalism and realism. If we look at the parade, everything is pretty much balanced, so it's correctly white balanced in that environment. And then if we look at the vector scope, you can see the trace is centered as well, which further accentuates the fact that, you know, this is a fairly balanced and neutral shot coming in already. The things that kind of help do that as well is getting the information accurately from the DOP as well. So you'll notice coming in here, I've used a project setting for the decode quality and a project setting for the decode within DaVinci Resolve of this raw footage coming in, and I'll go through the settings of that soon. But what you'll notice is that the ISO is set at 800 just here, and the color temperature is set to 5600. Now that wasn't idle knowledge I just randomly put in. That was knowledge that came directly from the director of photography. So this is why that raw is balanced and neutral as it comes in, as the DOP wanted it, based on that little bit of information gathering. So as a colorist, as much information you can get from the DOP and the client pre-grade is vital, really, because that can help mitigate any kind of later correction that you might think you need to do. Also, a chat with the DOP is really important, because you say, right, do you want it to be neutral in this scene, or do you want it to have a warm orange hue? Is that what you were trying to get? So that that conversation really needs to happen as much as it's possible. Okay. So let's just look at the grade itself and break down a little bit what I've done in this node and my thinking behind it. So if I go through each one of these, you can see what they do. And the reason that there's so many nodes, to be honest, this could have been two or three nodes really, but what you're seeing here is a conversation happening, is those minor adjustments. So I usually start at this primary grade stage, which is sitting in this third node, and by default when I start a grade I leave a blank node prior to my first primary corrections and adjustments, and that's mainly so I can go back and do any signal changes or kind of color correction changes prior to what I've done. So I leave an empty one to allow for any of those adjustments, but you can always add empty ones prior to that by just right clicking on a node, add node, and add serial before, and that'll add a node before the one that you're currently working on. But also I have so many nodes when I'm working with a client is so that I can see the adjustments as it goes along, and it almost gives you unlimited undos, really. So if they're clearly labeled, which I kind of fastidiously do as well, you can see that this is one stop down, so it says -1 stop and minus saturation. So that was a note coming from the DOP saying, look, could we stop it down one more stop after we rendered it out and looked at it on a few systems, and could we stop down the saturation a bit? So if I was to select that and disable it, so if I was to go Control D to disable that, you can see what that node is doing. It's stopping it down one stop, and it's also knocking down the saturation a little bit as well. If I took my primary adjustment away, you can see that that is the flat footage coming in with some of the other adjustments on the other nodes affecting, but that's pretty much where the primary adjustment has happened. So that was typically the first node. What you've got here as well, there's an offset lift. So this was just lifting the whole exposure one. So in fact, that was what, I've just managed to close the software. That was what was happening prior. So we lifted the exposure, the whole exposure, but then stopped it down again. So you can see this conversation kind of happening. These two in essence cancel one another out. Mid-tone boost is just pushing the mid-tones on their own and isolating those. So if I was disabled that, you can see this lift in the mid-tones, just to give more of a form factor to the key light and the fill light side of things. It's just to boost the information that's already there, the hard work that's been put in by the DP, but you're just pushing it a little bit further just to give a slightly contrasty look, but without boosting everything else. Then if you come up to this mid-tone detail, and if we zoom in, blue, there's a blue saturation. So basically I've added some blue shadows, some blue tint to the shadows, and put some mid-tone detail in. So if you can see that without and then with, it's kind of cooling down the shadow area but keeping certain flesh tones intact. Okay, and adding some sharpening just to those important areas where we want the viewer's eye to be drawn. Okay, in the mid-tones. So that's just sharpening to the mid-tones. And then in this one, as you can see, it's a red lift to accentuate the blood. So if we take that away, if you just focus on the lip area, the cheeks, and if we were to go to where the shot is particularly, the blood is well lit, so here say, and I toggle that node back on, you can hopefully see in this little recording that we've boosted that red colour. So let's zoom in this area in particular, getting to a point where that blood is particularly well lit, and obviously because it's well lit, it's well saturated. So there you go. We haven't boosted it too far, but if you look at it before and then afterwards, you can see that there's a real lift in saturation. Also, what's going on here is I've got these bars on to this output blanking. This wasn't in camera, so if you were to come to where it says timeline, output blanking, and reset it and take those off, you can see the 16:9 frame that's coming off the camera. But again, as on request of the filmmakers themselves, they wanted a 2:39 CinemaScope blanking, which is what we've got here. Okay. Also, you'll notice that all these nodes currently are sitting in the clip. Okay. One thing that's been applied to the whole timeline, the entire film, are some other nodes. So if we were to toggle to the timeline, you can see that you can add nodes that affect the whole timeline. Now if I was to toggle this one off, you can see that what that is doing is just shifting the black point. And again, that came from working closely with the DP just to accentuate the black point of our footage. Okay. Also, what we've got is a vignette, so which is literally a simple, if we were to come here, you can see there's a simple circular power window with a large feathering, and you can see it in the node there, and in that you can see that the whole the highlight area has been brought down, but also the midtones have been brought down and the offset's been brought down. So if we were to look at the primary bars, you can see that the middle lot of gamma has been brought down in particular, just to bring down the mid-tone details. So if I was to toggle that on and off, you can see just draws the eye in to the center of our frame, but also gives it that quality of a that's right for the genre possibly, and is right for the mood of the piece. And lastly, but one of the most important things I always do on my timeline nodes is have this final node prior to the output, which is my clumsily labeled as gamut legal. But what this is if I was to bring up my scopes and you were to look at the waveform, and you can see we've really crushed that black part down at the bottom. But because I've pushed my shadows towards the blue, and I've pushed them quite a bit, and because we've done other pushes into the black area, so let's just take this black point off for a second so you can see. You can see the bottom of that now. And also if I was to turn the vignette off, which further pushes the edges towards shadow, and then I'm going to turn my gamut off. And as I toggle that off, can you see what it's doing? If I toggle it off, look, there's color information, luminance information for particular color channels, red and green and blue, that is clipping, is kind of, it's been crushed on the, but beyond zero. Now the problem is what that does is two things. You get saturated shadows, oversaturated shadows, where the definition of your shadow being dark and being black becomes falsely saturated. Saturation dissipates with a lack of signal, with a lack of light. But when you're adding these quite broad pushes into the shadow range, what you tend to do is oversaturate deep shadows, and that's often makes it look like it's had a LUT dropped on it or effect. It looks quite amateurish. So what you'll find a lot of colorists doing is actually bringing desaturating the very darkest shadows. So if I was to put that gamut legal back on, you can see if you focus on this area that actually it takes away the blue tinge in those very deep shadows. That's it, on there, off, on, and brings back a true black value in those very deep shadows. Okay, and I'll show you how to do that in a second. But more importantly, it says that whatever color information is going beyond this 0 point is pure black. There's no color information kind of going off into this beyond zero area. In other words, in terms of color gamut accuracy or being legal, when this is put through some scopes, there's no red or blue green information going out of this legal area because it's being clipped and it's being sorted out prior to it going over that line. So it's being desaturated before it goes over that line. You were pulling all those color channels looking to beyond that black area. It's quite an important kind of industrial point, but it's not just an aesthetic point. It's good for aesthetics, but also it means that I know that when this is put through a kind of idea. In an ideal situation, I could have done with a hardware legalizer, where it could definitely kind of very cleverly kind of go through and make sure none of this color information is going beyond this 0 point. But that for me is just like a kind of slightly paranoid thing to make sure that I know there's not much color, if any color information, going beyond this 0 point. And the important factor of that is when it comes back, when it's reinterpreted by a different color gamut or a different display, it doesn't come back as some other color that I didn't want, because any color information you send beyond this point could be reinterpreted incorrectly when it's played back. So it's important that you kind of check that that's at least desaturated. There's not much color information, if any, going beyond that point. So when it comes back, it just comes back as neutral. So that's what I tend to do on every project, okay, no matter what genre and what style and how contrasty it is. So let's put our vignette back on so you can see what that's doing. And let's just readjust that black point back again. Okay. So that's all sitting on the timeline. So those nodes there are affecting the whole timeline, all of these shots all at once. So I tend to sit vignettes on there, any color gamut kind of legalization kind of things there. And also I've put this overall, which was an overall comment to bring the thing into a certain look and a certain range from the DOP and director. So you can see this is very dark, but also you can see our skin tones when they're lit fairly well are sitting in a good skin tone range. If we were to base it on an Ansel Adams scale, you can see if I was to line up this scope with my shot, you can see that my skin at its well lit point is actually sitting at a 5 or a 6. So if even this is a dark scene, we have, if you compare that to the raw footage coming off the camera, we've expanded that contrast and we've put some work in to make sure that our skin tone is sitting around a 5 and a 6. And if you don't know entirely what that means, is that look back at my other videos when I talk about exposure and where to place a skin tone, where to place a black point, white point. So it's giving some contrast to the shot. We're going for a particular look, and I'm going to break down what that look was. So I'm going to start a new project now and just bring this one shot in, and let's just go through the process. Might not come out exactly the same, but we're going to go through the process of creating this shot roughly how I created it in DaVinci. So we're going to create a new project. I'm not going to save, and we're going to call this okay. So what we need to do is make sure our project settings are correct before our footage comes in. So I'm going to press on this little cog at the bottom. I'm going to be working at 4K, so Ultra HD here. Even though the footage is 5K, we're going to scale all that detail down into this Ultra HD 4K setting. It's 24 frames a second, and we're not going to have to. I'm not monitoring this or anything like that. So let's save that at that point, and then come back up and image scaling, optimize for playback. Definitely worth doing. Optimize for playback. So a lot of the default properties now in DaVinci Resolve 12.5 are geared towards optimizing your playback with raw footage. I'm going to come down to the color here. There's nothing really that applies there, but this camera raw, this is where I'm going to set up my project settings for how this footage is treated as it comes in. So I'm going to go to where it says red on this pull down menu here. Now my decode quality, I'm going to go for half res good. So we're not going to decode the raw and its best quality when color grading, when playing back. But when we deliver, we are going to force this debayering process, this converting raw data into an image. We're going to force that to the highest quality possible. But for now, we're going to use that as half res good, and that's so we can get the optimal playback when working with a client. We don't want to be waiting for a RAM preview all the time and stuttering away. Playback quality, we're going to go for quarter res. Yeah, so when we're playing, it's going to be quarter res. When we pause, it's going to be half res good. Bit depth, I've stuck with 10. Time code, camera. But we're going to go for some project settings here. So set the decode using project. I know that the color science was version 2. We're going to use red color 4, which should be what came off this particular camera. And then we're going to use red log. So we're going to use the logarithmic information from that file. So this is all our project setting here. Also in here we've got our ISO setting, so I'm going to set that to 800, and I know it's shot at 5.6. So all of this needs to be saved. So now if I was to bring in my footage, so let's Last Viking, let's see if we can find our particular file. I should have really looked at what it was called first. That's not the one. I should be able to spot it really. Let's save ourselves some time. Here you go. This is one thing I didn't think about when I started this. So let's go File, Save Project. I'm going to go to the Project Manager. I'm going to double click this, and I'm just going to double check what the file was called that we used in this shot. It was a 0016006.730. So let's go to my project manager. Let's see if I can remember this now. So let's go to my media tab. Let's go to the details and let's see. Oh look, they're all 730. I think it was that, wasn't it? This was our one. Yeah, that looks very familiar. Look at that. So let's add that into our media pool. Let's come to our edit. Now I haven't got an XML here, that's how I brought it in from the editor. So I'm literally going to create a new timeline using the selected clips. And there we go. There's our footage coming in, and if we check our camera raw settings, it's using the project settings we set up. It's using Color Science version 2, red color 4, red log, and it's 5,600 kelvins for the color temperature, and it's 800 ISO. So we've got one node sat here. Let's zoom out a bit now. Let's get to where this clip starts. And what I tend to do with a long take like this is think about it in narrative stages. What are the key points that I'm going to use as my reference for getting this exposure and this color grade right? So for me, it's the burst through the door with the door open, and also I've got this technical issue that we've got this really broad exposure range here, and I want to keep this detail intact whilst keeping our interior elements intact. We've then got the bit where he stares and he kind of passes a glance, which is him kind of going, right, I've seen something there, so I'm going to use that as a point. And also it's got a lot of flesh tone detail in it, blood and so on and so forth, and then the laying down here. So let's go to this point here. I'm going to get to where we are, where he's just turning towards the camera, because that for me is the kind of hero shot, as it were, of this particular clip. So there we go. Got some well lit flesh tones in there, the eye detail and all those kind of things, and blood. So here we are. I've got my first node already set up. I am going to literally add another node after that. So I leave this blank ready, and I'm going to call this one primary. So I'm going to change the label, and we'll call this primary, just like this, and this is where I'll do my primary adjustment. So let's get my scopes up, and let's think where we want this skin tone to be. So if we were to line this up, look, you can see this is the skin tone area here, and actually it's not too bad. So let's go into our controls here, the primary bars if you want, whatever, you could use primary wheels, bars or log, it's up to us. But for this, I'm going to start with the primary bars. I'm just going to lift the offset a little bit to get that skin tone roughly where I want it to be, a 5 and a 6 here, no higher because it's a very dimly lit scene. Then I'm going to take my lift, my shadows, and I'm going to bring that down. And knowing what I know now about the client's requests, I'm going to bring this quite far. Okay. And now because I've brought that down, I've also brought my down. So I'm just going to lift the highlight area. This are these specular highlights here. Look, I want to preserve the detail in them, but I just want to lift them up slightly. Say here, and that's brought my skin tone back into that range. Look, so if we were to toggle this on and off, that's the flat coming in. And by its very nature, by adding this contrast into the shot, we've also boosted the saturation. So if we were to look at our vector scope, you can see it's very centered here. That's before the contrast, that's afterwards, and that's by adding no additional saturation to our shot. So there we go, there's a starting point, a primary adjustment. If we look at our parade, because we set up our color temperature correctly, they're pretty much balanced. Yeah. And we can also look at our flesh tone line just to see where this flesh tone is sitting. So just to do that, we could literally just draw a power mask around this area, just crudely, just to isolate the skin. And if I was to press the highlight symbol here, I can see that that is sitting bang on that skin tone line there. Yeah, so if we isolate just the skin, you can see that we've got a good accurate skin tone there. Right, so let me just turn that power window off, and we're back with our primary adjustment here. So let's just scrub back through the shot and see how that's been handled with our door open here. So let's go. There we go. And you can see actually what's happening is, without any secondary adjustments, we've preserved quite a bit of this outside information. There is some clipping here. So what I'm going to attempt to do is bring down the highlights on their own. Now, you used to be able to only do this in log controls, but in 12.5 they've introduced this highlights option within the primary controls as well. So let's just see where that takes us. And you can see we can bring back some of that primary information, and we've maybe brought down our mid-tone slightly, because ultimately it is a primary control, which we have. So let's get him back turning towards camera. So bringing those highlights down, we have brought down. So if we were to undo, you can see what happened. So let's so we've got it in a good highlight range there. Let's go back. And as we bring these highlights down, I just want you to keep an eye on what's happening here. So it might be that we have to do some secondary isolation, but let's just see. Let's go to our log controls. So each area is treated separately, and let's bring our highlights down with that. So that's less destructive, and I'll be tempted just to bring the mid-tones up a nudge, and let's just come through. Turn. And you can see that if we were to just lift, actually let's not use the log controls to do that. Oops. Let's go back to primary bars and just push our gamma up a smudge, like so. And then we might just need to re-bring our lift down a bit. Okay, so we've got the good skin tone there again. And let's see if we've got more of our highlight range intact. Yeah, there we go. So we know these are bright. So if we turn this all off again, look, we preserve that detail outside, and we've kept our skin tones where we want them lighting wise. Okay, now now we can start to think about some of the connotations and the themes of this scene. Now we're saying that this is kind of a gritty, dirty, point in the story, and also this is a sense that this is the mortal world, the dirty, grimy mortal world, and that's in sharp comparison to the very warm, angelic, almost glowing, but also slightly threatening world that he then transcends into later on in the narrative. So we need to have that narrative shift. So at the moment this is neutral, yes, it's accurate, but it's not necessarily akin to what we're thinking about narratively. So what I then going to do here is we're going to add a parallel node. Actually, let's just undo that. So before I add the parallel node, I'm going to add another serial node. Then right click on this and go add parallel node. So we're basically, these two nodes are working in parallel to one another without destroying or affecting one another. So they're only combined here, and they're just taking the data as it comes out of this node, and they're working separately in parallel with one another and then coming back together again. So let's first off, on this top one, I'm going to pull out and cool off some of these shadow areas. So if we were to come into our primary wheels, come to our lift area, and let's pull to the opposite side. So if you think our skin tone is sitting here, if you imagine your vector scope, we're going to pull in the opposite direction. So I'm just going to pull gradually in this direction. Just need to go far. There we go. So we can go really far if we wanted to, but let's just pull in that direction, say. So if we were to isolate that nose, we go Control D, you can see what that is done. Okay, so now I also want to kind of accentuate and sharpen the mid-tone area. Now you could have isolated this with a using the qualifier on this particular node and sharpening it, but again in this second part of this second window of these color wheel controls, they've introduced a mid-level detail, so it looks at the mid-tones and allows you to sharpen that separately. So I'm going to pull up the sharpening up to that area, and what that's done is sharpened that mid-level detail. So on this, if we were to label it, it's a blue and mid sharpen. There we go. So if we toggle it on and off, that's the flat shot coming in. This is what we're working towards now. Okay. And by adding that blue, we've started to desaturate some of the kind of warmness out of it anyway, because we've gone to the opposite color in the spectrum. But on this node, I want to accentuate this blood a bit more. So we've gone very blue here, but I want to pull back the kind of the very raw nature of this blood, because we're saying this is a violent time, a violent point in the story, and to accentuate that would be to accentuate the blood. So I'm just going to get to where the blood is particularly well lit. So let's just scroll through all that lovely detail. Very hard on his movement. There we go, that might work for us. And what we're going to do is I'm going to come over on this particular node, come to the curves, and come to the we can come to the hue versus saturation. Let's try that first. And we get this eyedropper tool because we're on this, and if we press on there, you can see it puts a point on here, and it allows us to then push the saturation of that particular color. Oh, I'm pushing the wrong. It's actually this dot here, the black dot. So let's lift that up, and what that does is saturate that particular, if we take it up straight, that particular selection, or we can desaturate it. So let's just lift that particular saturation, and if we were to look at our vector scope, you'll see this trace going towards the red line here. Let's just disable our node. You can see what we've done. We've left the rest of the trace alone, but just pushed the saturation towards that particular red value. So now we've still got this blue hue, but we've got this very saturated red tone. Here we go. just that particular red. Now again, we could have taken more time, and it might be that we just need to restrict how much of this red it's taking. So we could actually just pinch this in this side and pinch it in this side, just to get very much a very bespoke selection of that red. So it's only really affecting the lip now and the blood. Okay, so again, we're starting to build our look. And let's put our blanking on. So timeline output blanking 2x39. And we might want to just now come to our timeline and add some of our timeline effects. So let's come up to this timeline. By default, the timeline doesn't have any nodes. So let's add node, serial node. So let's go add serial node, there we go. And in this first serial node, I am just gonna do my vignette. So let's come to here. Let's draw a circle. Let's scale this right up, because remember, lenses are spherical, not eggs. Okay. And then let's soften this up by dragging the red line out and get a really soft vignette. And then we're just going to press this little icon here to invert that. Let's keep an eye on our waveform, and what we're going to do is just pull down the edges of this in the mid gamma. So let's come to our gamma bars, say, and let's pull down the gamma in the outer area just to vignette that off. Okay, so if you do want to see the mask but you still want to see the effect, just turn this off here, and then we can toggle the node on and off. Yeah, and that you dial that into taste. Okay, so there we go, there's our vignette. And also, like I said before, I'm going to add my my last node on the timeline is going to be this gamma correction. I'm going to show you how I do that now. It's fairly easy to do. Come to your curves and come to your luma versus saturation. And what we're going to do is pick here, but not scale down. So let's keep my finger on shift as I do this. And then I'm going to put a point to kind of legalize my whites as well. So what we're saying is from this darkness onwards, as we pull down here, we're desaturating this area here. So anything that's pure black or almost pure black, we're going to desaturate. So we're going to pull down and to about here, say, yeah. Same thing with whites. Anything this kind of intense and towards white, we're just going to pull down as well. So we're just legalizing the white and black. So if we toggle this off, you can see what it's doing. It's pulling up any colors that are almost pure black look, any color information that's going beyond that line, and pulling it up and flattening it and neutralizing it. Yeah, and if you look at my shot, it's got this very blue hint in all the shadows, and there's too much saturation in those deep dark shadows. If I was to then toggle my node back on, you can see it makes those blacks blacker, but we've still got that blue hue in the midtones. So it gives it, not only does it aesthetically look less kind of effecty, less lutty, less kind of amateur, but it just gives it a sense of real graduation and realism from shadows through to this blue, through to these reds and these highlights. Okay, and if we were to go back to our highlight range at the beginning, you'll also see that here as he comes through the door. Right, it takes a while to come through the door. If we were to look at some of these highlights here and look at this value, you can see it's just then pinching in any color information that might be trying to go off the top of the scale. Okay, there we go. So we've got this nice kind of cool, dirty, grimy, kind of granular quality to this, but we've just pushed it that little bit more. And maybe because we've pushed the contrast so much, we've introduced a little bit too much saturation. So let's come back to our clip, and perhaps after this primary, before this push here, let's desaturate some of this signal that's coming into these parallel nodes. So what we're going to do is just add another serial node. which annoyingly goes down there, look. In fact, let's not put it there. I'm actually going to desaturate it before it comes into my primary adjustment, just to see, just to throttle the whole thing back a bit. And what you've got here is this color boost as well. In essence, what the color boost is only desaturate or saturate the mid-tone level information, and again tries to avoid saturating or desaturating shadow. So again, that's quite a handy feature in 12.5. I'm just going to pull this back and just watch this a tiny bit. So that's where we were, and let's just pull it back a nudge. So let's just toggle that on and off. Yeah, that's just enough. And again, based on the director and the DOPs, they really wanted this shadow detail to be really black. So let's just show it just in this instance, just for the sake of it. Let's have here, so what we're going to do is any of these stuff is just lifted, we want to make pure 0, pure black. So you can see that the vignette is knocking that down to pure black value here. We want to push the whole thing. So I'm going to do a node before. You could do this at the clip level, but let's just do it on the timeline level just to show you how that's done. And what I could do is actually use a little S curve if I wanted to, instead of just pulling. So let's get hold of the dark area we want to affect. So let's just think there's black here, look, and you can see it's just there. And let's pull the and let's get the brightest point here. So let's shift click here just to get a dot without dragging the curve, which is annoying. And let's maybe nudge this to the side slightly, and let's pinch this in slightly, maybe to, oh no, we don't want to be doing this, we've got that middle point, let's get rid of that. So it might be that we're pulling in this shadow a bit and lifting this area here. Not sure about that, not sure if it's doing what I want it to. So actually, let's come to something that's a bit more important here. Maybe let's just try bringing the whole lift down. Let's drag that lift down a bit, or we could use this separate new shadow control. Let's see what that does. So let's bring down the shadow area. Let's really crunch that up, just like so. So if we go along, but by crunching it up, we've lost some of our mid-tone. So then we could just do a mid-tone push after that, by just putting in mid-tone point there, and let's put some 2 points in here, and just lift our mid-tone area. Let's put these back where they were. Again, not liking that, just because of the amount of saturation we've got in there. So it might be that we just have to push our gamma up a bit to compensate. And there we go. So we've got a nice strong black value. We've pushed our mid-tones. You can just see how this comes out in this recording. So we trust our scope, we know that we've flattened out those black areas. We're decoding at this lower quality, so we're not getting the full representation of what this could look like. But we've got something that looks very different as to how it did before. We could carry on just throttling back saturation. We've got this really dirty granular quality to things. And if we were to kind of, with this slightly cooler desaturated look to things, because we've boosted the contrast a bit, we might have to go back and redo our saturation push. And let's just nudge a frame at a time. Let's get him in focus there. So if we were to toggle everything off, that's it coming in, that's it finished with there. off, on, off, on. So there we go. There's our full screen footage, playing away and looking lovely and nice. I don't think you can play full screen when I've got this video recorded. This graphics card, if you want to know, the graphics card I'm using actually is an NVIDIA GTX 1080, and it's running fantastically using the RAW. I can pretty much play it with all these nodes on without recording this video guide in real time. And bearing in mind this is 5K RAW coming into a 4K timeline, it's still getting up to about 19 frames even with this video recording at the same time, so it's doing pretty well. Okay, so there's our footage. You see it looks a lot better when we're playing. There we go. So that's how I approach the grading process. I might add another video looking at the warmer shots, but in essence the process is still the same. You're kind of making those judgments, you're thinking about it narratively and thematically, you're using a few little techniques to maybe boost certain areas, either for a technical issue or more importantly for a thematic, like boosting the blood. And also some of those things to consider at timeline level about those color gamut corrections and bringing things down. So if we were to isolate all these, that's our timeline push off look. Yeah. There's our additional black or mid-tone lift. So that was our black crush coming in there. There's our little gamma lift just to bring our mid-tones back. Our vignetting and our correction to the blue, very blacks, very highlights. And then if we come to our clip, we've got the new blank node coming in just to allow us to do things. We've got this slight desaturation here. We've got our primary adjustment. We've got our blue shift and mid-tone sharpening. And then we've got our blood accentuating here, which is then brought all back together and outputted here. So hopefully that's proved to be useful. It might not be useful at all, but I thought that'd be a very, well, a useful thing for people to look at, especially when working with RAW, because often you don't know where to start. I haven't used any LUTs or presets because I'm not a big fan of them. Sometimes they work really well, but they are in essence stupid. So they don't allow for much bespoke control. I prefer to kind of dial things in on a project by project basis. And that's it, thank you. So hopefully you found that useful, and thanks again to the filmmakers, Philip especially, Philip Stevens and Stuart McGregor, the DOP, but also everyone involved, and please go and watch the film and see and support it so we can make things in the future. Cheers.